And today we are going to talk about hacking humans, addressing vulnerabilities in the advancing medical device landscape. So the first question is usually, how did I end up here? A couple of weird things happened that led me to wanting to study this. In undergrad, I studied neuroscience and psychology. And once I graduated, I started working in pharmaceuticals, doing FDA reviews for studies involving pharmaceuticals and medical devices. During that time, I kept having weird medical device vulnerabilities and reports kind of come across my desk, and I was interested in learning why this kept happening, and I kind of fell down the InfoSec rabbit hole and started a career in security as an analyst. And this is kind of my side thing, is learning about medical device vulnerabilities and just trying to figure out the regulations behind them. So first, we can talk about connected devices. The Internet of Things is comprised of devices that possess internet connectivity, sensors, electronics, etc., and that use the internet to communicate and interact with other devices. Most of the time, these devices can be remotely monitored and controlled. These devices can be segmented into a variety of categories, including consumer, commercial, and industrial applications. Consumer applications are created for consumer use and include connected vehicles, smart home devices, connected healthcare, which we're discussing here, and appliance remote monitoring capabilities. Commercial applications are also comprised largely of medical devices. These devices are generally used for data collection, remote health monitoring, and emergency notification. It can also include transportation system controls, vehicle-to-everything communication, and building and home automation. Finally, we have industrial applications of IoT devices, which include manufacturing devices, especially digital control systems, and agricultural devices. So let's talk the Internet of Medical Things, IoMT. It's basically IoT, but make it healthcare. IoMT is a connected system of medical devices and apps that collect medical data that is then provided to information systems through networks. A lot of times, these devices enable remote health monitoring and emergency notification. These devices can range from heart rate monitors and internal defibrillator implants, aka items that are used directly on a person, to smart beds and diagnostic machines, or items that are used to aid in a patient's care. So why the fuss over medical devices and their connectivity? They become such an integral part of our healthcare tech landscape that the numbers are pretty staggering. 6.7 million people in the United States each year on average receive implantable medical devices. Aside from that, hospitals tend to have 10 to 15 connected devices per bed in their facilities. The problem with this is that these devices boast the latest smart technology and enable connectivity with other devices. However, this generally leaves them vulnerable to threats, and people are starting to notice and exploit them. Medical device recalls increased 126% just in the first quarter of 2018, and a lot of these recalls were due to security vulnerabilities and threats. Most of the weaknesses were discovered by government entities and academic institutions. The FDA is just now beginning to release preliminary guidance to both assess impact and establish regulations for these devices. Let's dive in a little deeper and discuss how vulnerabilities in medical devices range from rudimentary to advanced, how this can endanger both patient information and safety, and how we can devise a more rigid system to diminish the threat of these attacks. First things first, why should we even use these devices if they're so vulnerable? According to Goldman Sachs, connected medical devices save the U.S. on average $300 billion in healthcare per year. They increase revenue and decrease costs, which is ideal. They also provide access to better and new types of information that a patient either may have not have had access to previously or hadn't had a way to measure. This, in turn, leads to more accurate underwriting and new pricing models for consumers. These devices will also help improve the quality of life for many of the patients that use them. Remote monitoring is made possible by connected medical devices and allows healthcare providers to capture patient data instantaneously, as well as allow the patient to live their life more normally than they previously may have been able to. So first, let's talk about some implantable devices. This is the Medtronic CareLink 2090, the software for an internal defibrillator. This works similarly to a pacemaker. The manufacturers had a software deployment network that allowed for the download of new software directly to the pacemaker. However, security researchers found vulnerabilities in which an individual could easily update the programmer with a third-party software. The FDA issued a bulletin disabling the SDN and requiring manual updates until the vulnerability could be fixed. This was discovered and publicized by Billy Rios and Jonathan Butch from Whitescope. They uncovered a chain of vulnerabilities in Medtronic's infrastructure that an attacker could exploit to control implanted pacemakers remotely, deliver shocks patients don't need or withhold ones they do, and essentially cause real harm. In essence, the 2090 uses a VPN to securely download its updates, but doesn't verify that it's still connected to the VPN before downloading the updates. The device will establish an encapsulated IP-based VPN connection to a Medtronic-hosted update network. Once established, it makes a request to an HTTP non-TLS server across the VPN, which responds and provides the updates. However, the programmer-side service responsible for this HTTP request doesn't check to make sure it's still connected to the VPN before actually making the request. This could be exploited if an attacker terminated the VPN and intercepted the HTTP request and responded with malicious updates via a man-in-the-middle attack. So in terms of mitigation, Medtronic disabled the network-based software update mechanism, including the VPN and HTTP sub-services. Users were instructed to obtain and apply updates via controlled USB dongles. It was also recommended that users minimize network exposure for all control system devices and ensure that they were not accessible from the internet. Next up, we have infusion pumps, which are used to deliver medicine in controlled doses in a hospital setting. We're specifically going to talk about the Smiths Medical Medfusion wireless infusion pump, but similar vulnerabilities have been found in nearly identical pumps. It was discovered that remote attackers could gain access to both the communication and therapeutic modules in these pumps. There were various attack vectors, easy buffer overflows due to a lack of verifications, hard-coded credentials, improper access controls, and improper certificate validation. Scott Gaio, a security researcher, identified a handful of vulnerabilities in this pump. And in short, these pumps are used to deliver small doses of medication in acute care settings. So a bit of a deeper dive into some of the vulnerabilities. A third-party component in the pump did not verify the input buffer size prior to copying, which led to buffer overflow and allowing remote code execution on the targeted device. While a difficult exploitation, it was potentially extremely malicious. A third-party component used in the pump read the memory out of bounds, which caused the communication module to crash. Also, we had hard-coded credentials. The pump, when left with its default network configuration, uses hard-coded credentials to establish a wireless connection automatically, even if Ethernet was connected and active. We also see improper access control on the device. The FTP server on the pump doesn't require authentication. This server also contains hard-coded credentials, which are not fully initialized. Telnet on the pump also used hard-coded credentials, which could be exploited if the pump was configured to allow external communications. And they did not validate the host certificate, which left the pump vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack as well. My favorite vulnerability thus far, the infusion pump stored some passwords in the config file, which were easily accessible if the pump was configured to allow external communications. Smiths released updates to mitigate these vulnerabilities, but also suggested that users apply defensive measures. These include assigning static IP addresses to the pump, monitoring network activity for rogue DNS and DHCP servers, ensuring network segments are segmented from other hospital and medical technology infrastructure, using VLANs, practicing password hygiene, and performing routine evaluations. In general, there are many connected devices within hospitals. These include imaging systems like ultrasound machines, MRI, PET, CAT scans, and X-ray machines, treatment equipment like infusion pumps, lasers, and surgical machinery, life support devices like ventilators, anesthetic equipment, and dialysis machines, and medical monitors like O2, blood pressure, ECG, and EEG machines. Most of these don't have any sort of inherent antivirus in place, which poses a problem. This allows malware to quickly spread between connected devices. With all these dangers, why are connected hospitals and medical systems a good thing? Connected devices, like the ones mentioned previously, substantially reduce the amount of time it takes to read and record vitals and other information. Each patient in the hospital has, on average, 3 to 6 medical monitoring devices attached to them. So what kind of incidents are plaguing these hospitals and medical systems? 2018 was a record-breaking year for data breaches in healthcare alone. Since October 2009, there's been disclosure of almost 195 million healthcare records, which equates to affecting 59.8% of the United States population. So we're going to count down here. The number 5 biggest healthcare breach last year happened to MSK Group, which is an orthopedic medical network. They discovered in May that their network had been infiltrated by hackers, and they'd been grabbing data from the system for several months. Records of 566,000 patients were breached. There weren't really any details I could find of the breach other than a security event and that a hacker had access to the system intermittently for months. Number 4 was California Department of Developmental Services. This was kind of unusual as it was a physical office break-in. Sensitive information of roughly 15,000 employees and parents of minor patients was compromised, as well as the PHI of 582,000 patients. The break-in occurred at the DDS Legal and Audits Offices building in Sacramento. The trespassers ransacked files, vandalized and stole state property, and started a fire. Number 3 was the Employers' Retirement System of Texas. A flaw was discovered in the ERS online portal that allowed some members to view the protected health information of other members after logging in. Up to 1.2 million individuals' personal health information was breached. A flaw in a specific search function in ERS Online, a password-protected online member portal, allowed some but not all ERS members to see some other members' or current beneficiaries' information. A concerned member reported that, while performing a specific search for his own information, he was able to see the first and last names, social security numbers, and ERS employee IDs for 50 other members. They shut down the ERS Online and disabled the flawed search function. Number 2 happened to Unity Point Health. This was due to a phishing attack. It resulted in disclosed email credentials, and the PHI of 1.4 million individuals was breached. As is common in phishing attacks on businesses, access to email accounts was gained through the impersonation of a senior executive. A series of spoofed emails were sent to employees that appeared to have come from a trusted executive's email account. Employees who opened the email were instructed to click a link that required them to enter their email login information. That information was captured by the attackers, who were then able to gain access to the employees' email accounts. The largest breach last year was AccuDoc Solutions. This was a billing company that served for Atrium Health's hospital network. The personal health information of 2.7 million patients was leaked. Hackers accessed personal information on patients and guarantors, i.e. the individual paying for a patient's bill, including name, date of birth, address, insurance policy details, medical record number, invoice number, account balance, date of service, and in some cases, social security number. We also have some honorable mentions. Many were healthcare providers, some health plans and business associates. Oftentimes, the attack vector was through hacking or an IT incident, but there were a few that were due to unauthorized access and disclosure and even improper disposal of records containing PHI. So what are our solutions to these vulnerabilities? The FDA has issued guidance, both pre- and post-market, to offer recommendations for management of medical device security risks. Mitre unveiled a medical device security playbook in October 2018. This enables healthcare organizations to plan for and respond to incidents and develop a preparedness and response framework. The FDA is also leveraging the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's composed of 5 core functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. They've also been assembling information sharing analysis organizations and holding forums. Finally, they've been partnering with Department of Homeland Security in order to mitigate wider attacks. So part 1, let's talk about the FDA-issued guidance. The agency developed this guidance as a result of an executive order that was aimed at strengthening national security, economic stability, and public health and safety. The guidance is generally for medical device manufacturers and applies to any marketed and distributed medical device, which includes devices that contain software and firmware or programmable logic, software that's a medical device, which includes mobile medical apps, medical devices that are part of an interoperable system, and legacy devices, aka devices that are already approved on the market and in use. This FDA guidance goes into both pre-market, i.e. in testing and development, and post-market considerations for medical devices. The pre-market guidelines state that assets, threats, and vulnerabilities should be identified, that the assessment of impact of the threats and vulnerabilities on device function and end users should be performed, that there should also be both an assessment of threat likelihood and vulnerability exploitation and a determination of risk levels and mitigations, and an assessment of residual risk and risk acceptance data. Post-market, manufacturers should monitor cyber info sources for the identification and detection of vulnerabilities and risk, make sure that the software lifecycle processes are thorough and robust, assess and detect presence and the impact of a vulnerability, provide a process for vulnerability intake and handling, have a method of threat modeling, and have mitigations in place to address risk early and prior to exploitation. So as far as assessing exploitability goes, the FDA guidance outlines a common vulnerability scoring system, and that provides numerical ratings corresponding to high, medium, and low by assessing a number of factors, which includes the following: attack vectors and whether they're physical, local, adjacent, network, etc. The complexity of the attack, whether it's high or low, whether privileges are required to complete the attack, and whether user interaction is even required, the scope of the vulnerability, the impact that an exploit might have on confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, the exploit code maturity, whether it's high, functional, proof of concept, or unproven, the remediation level, whether unavailable, a workaround, a temporary fix, an official fix, or something undefined, and finally, the confidence in the report. These factors are weighted and aggregated into one of the scores on the vulnerability scoring system. Once the vulnerability exploit is rated, there's another side of the investigation. Because these devices are used on and for humans, we need to assess the severity of patient harm. The FDA provides a scale of 5 categories to assess patient harm. We start with negligible, which is just an inconvenience or temporary discomfort to the patient; minor, which might result in temporary injury or impairment but does not require medical intervention; serious, which results in injury or impairment requiring professional medical intervention; critical, which results in permanent impairment or life-threatening injury; and catastrophic, which results in patient death. It's also necessary to evaluate the risk of patient harm in medical device breaches or exploits. We need to determine whether the risk of patient harm is controlled, which is acceptable, or uncontrolled, which is unacceptable. Oftentimes, this is done by assessing a matrix with combinations of exploitability and severity of patient harm. The FDA recommends a binary determination with no gray areas, so one or the other. Controlled risk is present when there is sufficiently low or acceptable risk of patient harm due to the vulnerability. Manufacturers are asked to perform device enhancements that will strengthen security, deploy controls for a defense-in-depth strategy, perform routine updates and patching, and submit an annual report to the FDA if they're under pre-market approval. An example of a control risk could be as follows. A manufacturer receives a complaint that a gas blood analyzer has been infected with malware, and it's unknown as to whether the malware could alter data on the device. Once investigated, the presence of malware is confirmed. However, the malware doesn't result in the manipulation of unencrypted data stored and running through the device. The device's safety and performance is not impacted by the malware, and the manufacturer determines that the risk of patient harm is a controlled risk. Uncontrolled risk is present when there's unacceptable residual risk of patient harm due to insufficient risk mitigations and compensating controls. Manufacturers should consider exploitability of the vulnerability and severity of patient harm if exploitation is carried out. Manufacturers are asked to remediate uncontrolled risks as quickly as possible and report them to the FDA. An example of an uncontrolled risk could be as follows. A hospital submits a report that a patient was harmed after a medical device failed to perform as intended. Upon investigation, it was determined that the medical device malfunctioned as a result of exploitation of a previously unknown vulnerability in its software. The outcome of the investigation and impact assessment determines that the exploit impacts the device's safety and essential performance and could have contributed to the patient's death. A report is filed in accordance with the reporting requirements, and the manufacturer notified its customers and develops a validated emergency patch to remediate the issue. So as far as effective information security for medical devices goes, what are the elements of an effective cybersecurity program? This can vary from field to field, but in the medical device industry and according to the FDA, the basics are as follows. Maintaining safety and essential performance of devices, identifying cybersecurity signals that might affect the product, characterizing and assessing vulnerabilities, performing risk analysis and threat modeling, analyzing threat sources in order to provide a framework for risk introduced by an active adversary, incorporating threat detection capabilities, and performing impact assessment on all devices. Implementing device-based features to mitigate risk of harm, performing compensating controls assessments, and detecting and responding to any suspected vulnerabilities as soon as they appear. We also want to ensure that the risk of patient harm is adequately controlled by device features. Now for part 2, the Mitre playbook. Mitre, which I'm sure you've heard of, found after some research that after a breach, healthcare providers didn't really know with whom to communicate, what actions they were supposed to take, and what resources were available to them. The Mitre team worked with the FDA to identify stakeholders and develop a plan for preparedness and incident response. The first phase that Mitre wants us to consider is preparedness. Secure design of medical devices in question is a huge concern, especially identifying and securing any third-party components that might be part of the device, and providing service layer access during an incident in order to ensure minimal disruption of clinical ops and a more rapid response. Doing an asset inventory and knowing what is connected to the network is also a big part of preparedness. By maintaining a baseline set of information about each medical device, the provider will better be able to account for and manage devices before, during, and after an incident. Hazard vulnerability analysis is used to assess and identify potential gaps in emergency planning as well. Therefore, an emergency ops plan is also necessary to describe how a provider will respond to and recover from a threat, hazard, or other incident. Building upon this, communication is key during an incident. An incident response communications plan will help with all aspects of communication during the incident, especially with incident sharing, aka knowing how incident sensitivities can be shared, incident identification, incident notification or how outreach is initiated, situational awareness, and communication templates to streamline the process. Finally, user awareness training is important in preparedness for a security incident, especially in terms of classification and identification. The next phase of the Mitre playbook is detection and analysis. The first part of incident detection and analysis is identifying or establishing that an incident has occurred. Is what has gone on an actual incident? Next, we must categorize and prioritize the incident. This is where those charts and scales come in, so we know how severe an incident is and whether it impacts patient safety or not. Once we know the scope of the incident, we have to report. Oftentimes, there are formal and informal reporting obligations that accompany discovery of an incident. Analysis will be done once the initial incident parameters have been established in order to provide insights on both the vulnerability and the impact within the healthcare organization. Finally, documentation needs to be carried out. Phase 3 of the Mitre playbook is containment, eradication, and recovery. Once an incident is confirmed, response begins. Oftentimes, a healthcare organization will use a contain, clean, and deny strategy, and then monitor and record when cybersecurity criminal activity is suspected. It's important for these organizations to perform effective containment and minimize impact on healthcare delivery in other areas of the organization. Finally, phase 4 is the post-activity phase. Here we assess the lessons learned and conduct hot wash sessions to elicit feedback on future responses. We'll also engage a forensics investigation at this point if needed and make any plan updates we feel necessary for the future. Mitre and the FDA came together to streamline and standardize the playbook and the post-market guidance. They forged a partnership so that Mitre could provide the FDA with strategic and technical support. They also leveraged Mitre's expertise across multiple federally funded research and development centers and the independent research in the areas of cyber and homeland security. Both groups leveraged the NIST framework in order to create their plans with the hopes that the healthcare groups and device manufacturers will be well positioned to manage these incidents through planning and practice, along with the support and collaboration of manufacturers and regional and national partners. The difference in responsibility between device manufacturers and a healthcare organization that might experience an event firsthand are as follows. Device manufacturers need to protect their intellectual property through server hardening and authentication, secure their devices through code signing, secure boot and platform hardening, protect critical data through messaging, certs, encryption, and MPKI, and protect their manufacturing integrity through platform hardening and authentication. Healthcare organizations, by contrast, need to manage their contracts and requirements, perform holistic asset reviews and asset management, manage and mitigate risk, and detect anomalies in network security and security gateways. Both need to come together to ensure secure communication and access through authentication and access management. So the key takeaways of this presentation are as follows. Medical device technology is progressing faster than research on vulnerabilities for these devices. We need to begin to develop and implement a concrete plan for mitigation of risks to both patients and information in the healthcare system. And the FDA and Mitre guidance are a step in the right direction towards a universal program for leveraging these risks. And that is it. If there are any questions, let me know. Yes.
One of the things my company does is work with hospitals on their medical devices, and one of the things that we're finding is kind of going against what the FDA says in terms of network segmentation. They're actually flattening their networks, which kind of is the opposite of what the FDA wants. And I'm curious, at some point is the FDA going to basically put down and say you've got to do a better job of securing these devices?
Do you know why they're doing that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Just from our perspective, it makes it easier. I think that's what it is. And we're kind of like, we're not in a position to tell them you need to segment your network more, because that's how we advise them and support the devices and help them secure them, but we can't tell them how to run the network. So I just thought that was an odd thing that seems to be going against what the FDA said.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I think right now it's really just a guidance, but I know having worked on the regulatory side, we had a lot of sites that had practices where we were like, okay, you really shouldn't do that, but I don't really have a law that says you have to do this. So it'll be interesting to see whether they really harden it and say, yes, network segmentation, these are the exact parameters you need to follow if you're going to develop these kinds of devices, or not. I'm not sure where that's going to go.
Well, the other thing we're finding is that dealing with the OEMs, a lot of them still, the only support operating systems are unfortunately unsupported operating. I think the stat I heard from our cyber, is like 60% of the devices we have inventory are running on unsupported operating systems, which is a ridiculously high number. So if the FDA is pushing back on the OEMs to make sure that's getting more attention. That's just kind of something we run into.
Yeah, I ran into that a lot too. A lot of the software supporting the medical devices is just really, really out of date. I don't know if that's something that they'll be able to enforce eventually. I think it's going to be a little bit of a slippery slope getting there, but I think it's definitely possible. So, yes.
Have you heard of any feedback or industry research about setting up the equivalent of the same way an operating system, let's say, so that the device itself could have secure connections to get updates, things like that? Or is there no automation really out there yet?
I think people have kind of tried, and then this kind of thing happened. I think a lot of healthcare companies are kind of scared right now. I think they're getting a little scared away by some of these breaches, and they're saying, okay, let's go back to basics. Let's go back to hardware updates. Let's just keep everything off the internet right now. And I think I think eventually we'll get there. There'll be more secure design in that aspect. Yes.
So I couldn't hear the first question. Sorry, very well. I don't know if you mentioned this, but I think part of the reason as to why we're not getting quick updates on medical devices is because when you do those updates, if you change the devices enough, you have to get FDA clearance to do so.
That's what I was going to say.
Is that what you were saying?
Any minor, even Windows update has to be basically approved by the FDA before.
Right.
Basically, we're still running 70s error chips, so good luck secure boot.
So that kind of feeds into my question which is, we've got these frameworks like NIST and like Mitre's playbook. By design, they're pretty generalized. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if in your work, if you're finding that you're seeing very vastly different interpretations or very status quo beneficial interpretations of those frameworks in order to try to kind of bend those frameworks to the will of the operation as opposed to the will of what an ideal security world would want to say that framework means.
Absolutely.
And then so based on that, are those frameworks really what we need, and are they detailed enough, and are they going to be enough to actually protect us and protect those devices?
I don't think they're detailed enough yet. I think it's a good effort. I mean, this is the first thing of its type that's really come out in the last few years. And, before that, it was all just, regulations for legacy software and software that was off the shelf essentially for these devices. So, I don't know. I think I have seen various vendors of these devices and seen their reports. I've seen all of their FDA pre- and post-market documentation, and it's not, some of it I'm just like, no, I would not interpret it that way. But I think you get that in a lot of different industries, not just the healthcare industry. The people that are paying for the security services are going to interpret something differently than maybe the person that's concerned about security will.
So what worries me is trying to monopolize here. What worries me, I'm an attorney in civil, so what worries me is when I build a contract and I say, you are as a medical device company, you're going to make sure you follow this framework in building your security program, and then if you don't do it, I'm going to hold you liable if something happens. The problem with that is if you can interpret this framework or whatever the hell you want it to be, then I'm going to have a hard time holding you to liability if you have to reach your strategy. So I'm kind of trying to think through ways as to how do I get underneath the frameworks and essentially, without telling the device company what to do and causing an agency relationship, how do I hold them to a higher standard than that framework's going to be without, at the same time, instructing my device maker what to do or get into a place where they can't do what I'm asking them to do and then not have the framework available. Yeah,
it's definitely very nebulous, and I think it would be better, like the gentleman in front of you had said, if there had been a little bit more I guess, just defined parameters as far as this is exactly what you need to do in terms of segmentation, and this is what you need to do in terms of secure design. I think that would be helpful, but I think everyone's just on such different pages, especially in terms of development of technology, that we'd probably need to streamline that first as well. Yes.
Is the impression that the framework is saying, here's what to do, but not how to do it?
Yeah.
It generally is, yeah.
Also, CVS is incredibly brittle. The scorer decides everything, and usually the scorer is the company. So if I'm deciding that I don't want to get hit too hard, thoughts.
Yes, sir, in the back.
So two very loaded questions.
Uh-oh.
The first one is, the FDA does testing for all sorts of things, not just medical devices, but also implantable medical devices. Is software testing not part of that?
It is. Having worked in that regulatory position, I actually did have times when software for wearable devices came across my desk every once in a while. I think a lot of the problem is people aren't necessarily equipped to review it and don't really understand some of the security parameters that go with it. I was not a security professional when I did any of this review, so I was just like, oh yeah, that looks great. And I'm sure there were a lot of people that, especially within the FDA, that are like, we don't know what this means. It looks good to me. I don't know what the specifics of software secure design would be. So maybe that's a question for them as to how we maybe form a team of cybersecurity professionals to review this.
I'm kind of hoping that there's a manufacturer here. And then the second part of the question is, hospitals get, reviewed and inspected for all sorts of things, and it's standard industry practice in many industries to have your IT inspected. Are the connected medical devices not part of that inspection for medical facilities?
I am not sure on that. I would have to look into that.
So OCR has been about 3 years supposed to be doing desk audits of your cybersecurity practices in hospitals under the guise of, of course, HIPAA. But right now, it's just not doing it.
Right, but oftentimes the IT network and then the network that the connected devices are segmented, right? Or they're only scanning for, Windows 10 or Windows 7, and some of these devices are running something other than, right? In which case your scanners aren't going to see these devices.
That's one thing Michael actually does. Do some of that. A lot of his manual inventory, we'll integrate it more and more. But we're in that position of recommending what hospitals should do, but we can't say you have to.
Right, there's no authority out there actually telling you.
Right.
Yeah, so that's part of the problem is that where to go out there and sue, in which case the medical facilities are going to ask for regulation from Congress, which they've been avoiding so far, so that they can be held to a standard that everybody understands.
Anyone else? Oh, yes.
So I got a two-part question here. Have you seen? You talked a lot about the hospital software, hospital equipment and stuff. One of my companies has retirement communities. So do you see a lot of things happening with nurse call systems, especially as Cornell and Phillips upgrade to iOS devices with talkback and everything? Any issues there?
I have not seen any of that yet. From an attack vector perspective, I don't know if it would be as impactful as some of the other vulnerabilities, and that's maybe why I haven't seen too much of it yet, but I would say it's definitely possible. I mean, anything in your hospital infrastructure that's connected is definitely going to be vulnerable.
Also, along that same lines, what about MedPass software?
What specific software is that?
Medtelligent makes software called Alice, and it tracks all of their medication and their bedtime, shower times, all this stuff. Have you seen anything?
I have not seen anything about that yet, but I would say, again, along those same lines, it could definitely be something that would be vulnerable and easily targeted. So, yes.
So on a user side of what he's talking about, because I spent 3 years in hospitals and hospice care and nursing homes, so I'm very familiar with it.
Yes.
That's connected to all the telemetry
actually you interact with your healthcare provider through the patient portals, your records and everything are then transferred between you.
There have been a couple breaches. I think a couple of the healthcare system breaches that I went through actually did affect like kind of healthcare portals or even employee portals for healthcare systems. And a lot of times, yeah, the PHI was stored or was easily visible or something along those lines. I mean, if you just search healthcare breaches, I mean, there's so many. And a lot of them do seem to happen to those systems because it's people that are looking for personal information, social security numbers, credit card numbers, sometimes more of the financial things than necessarily the medical records. But anything identifiable seems to be what people will go after in these networks. So, yeah, I think there's definitely going to be a little bit of a crackdown in terms of securing that kind of software as well. Anything else? All right, well, you get 10 minutes of your time back. Thank you.